Good to see everybody out today. As most of you know, I am not the normal speaker. It's probably become obvious by now. But the elders have given me a chance to speak, and I'm grateful for that. I hope that something I say this morning can be helpful to each of you. I know this is something that I needed to hear, so hopefully it can be helpful for you as well. Now, as some of you know, my family and I recently went on a trip out west to see a couple national parks. We went to the Grand Tetons and Yellowstone, and other than the amazing scenery, the really interesting wildlife that we don't get around here, something else that I noticed while I was out there was that there were a lot of foreigners. Now, you may ask, well, how'd you know if they were foreigners? Well, I can't say 100%, but there were some things that kind of clued me into that. First, how they spoke. Maybe they had a different accent, or maybe they were speaking a different language entirely. And also their appearance at times. Maybe what they were wearing, the clothes they were wearing, or some other part of their culture that you could tell in their appearance that showed up. But it was pretty obvious usually. You could tell pretty quickly that, well, this person's probably not from around here. And actually, this idea, this idea of being a foreigner or a stranger, a pilgrim, a sojourner, different words used, but that actually shows up a lot in the Bible. And like I said, depending on the translation you use, it shows up as different words. But all of these words bring to mind the idea of being away from home in a foreign land. You may think about someone who seems a little bit out of place. Maybe they stand out a little bit. And again, some of the words we don't use every day. So I thought maybe we could just kind of look at some of the definitions. Pilgrim. When we think of pilgrim, we probably think way back at the start of America when they were coming over. And the definition, according to Merriam-Webster, one who journeys in foreign lands. There's also the word sojourn, which means to stay as a temporary resident. And then also exile. Now, when I looked up exile, it said a person who is in exile. I was like, well, that's not very helpful. But another definition is the state or a period of forced absence from one's country or home. Now, you find this idea in the Bible as early as Genesis. It actually shows up a lot in Genesis. So these are some of the passages that are related to this idea of being a stranger or a pilgrim, a foreigner. We're not going to go through all of them. But Genesis chapter 12, we read about how Abram was called by God to leave his homeland. And he was going to be journeying in a place that was foreign to him, that he didn't know. In Genesis 15, God told Abram that his descendants would be strangers in a foreign land. And of course, we know he was referring to Egypt. They would be down there 400 years, and they would be in bondage during that time. But they were going to be away from their homeland in that time. In Genesis 47, after Jacob and his family have come down into Egypt, he's talking to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh actually asks him how old he is. And so he said, the way he describes it, he says, the years of my sojourning are 130. So he recognized that he wasn't at home. He was in a different place. He was traveling in a foreign land. So this idea also comes up in the Psalms quite a bit. So just look at a couple examples. In Psalms 39, David writes in verse 12, "Hear my prayer, O Lord, and give ear to my cry. Do not be silent at my tears, for I am a stranger with you, a sojourner like all my fathers." And then in Psalm 119, verse 19, it says, "I am a stranger in the earth. Do not hide your commandments from me." But this concept isn't just something that we find in the Old Testament. It actually shows up in the New Testament as well. And we can see that they're kind of picking up on that idea. So look, beginning of 1 Peter, actually, when he's addressing that, or saying who he's addressing the book to, he says, "To those who reside as aliens in various places." And of course, we know he's not talking about outer space aliens. Although really, that kind of has the same idea to it. But the idea here is someone who's from a different country, a foreigner, a stranger, you might say. And then in 1 Peter chapter 2, starting in verse 9, actually, let's turn over there real quick. I'm just going to read a few verses here. 1 Peter chapter 2, I'm going to go 9 through 12. I'm so sorry, I just realized that this is not on. Well, any better? Yeah. Okay, sorry about that. So 1 Peter chapter 2, starting in verse 9, says, "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Beloved, I urge you, as sojourners and exiles, to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul." So here we see the idea that it's really not about, what nation you're from here on this earth. It's not about the race that you're from, but rather we are God's nation. We are God's special people that he has called out of the nations that we may be living in. Amen. But we do happen to find ourselves sojourning here on this earth and being exiled away from our true home. So I think it's pretty clear at this point that we've established that in the Bible, we see that God's people are identified as foreigners and strangers oftentimes. And I think it's worth asking the question, why is that? Why does God use that analogy, even for us today? We may look at it and say, well, I feel like I'm at home. I'm just here in America. This is where I was born. I feel like I'm at home. So why is it that he's using this analogy and reminding us back of the Old Testament when people who were in those situations, who weren't at their home? And I think there's a lot that could be said about that. But I want to make 4 main points on this idea of being strangers and exiles. And that is, we honor a different king, we have a different speech, we have a different appearance, and we have a different mindset. Now, I realized pretty quick, this could probably be its own mini-series. We're trying to cover a lot of ground here, so I think I won't hold you too long, though, but we'll make it through. So first thing, we honor a different king. So if you think about someone that's a foreigner or a sojourner, someone in a different land, it's natural to think, well, they would honor a different king. If someone was visiting here from, let's say, England, they would be still responsible to follow the laws while they're here in America. But we also know that they're ultimately going to be held accountable back home to a different government, right? And so similarly, as God's people, we too honor a different king compared to people in this world. And obviously that king is Jesus. In Revelation 19:16, Jesus is referred to as Lord of Lords and King of Kings. And he's also called the head of the church in Colossians 1:18. And I think that's important to consider because it's basically the rationale for the rest of this lesson. If you think about, and then there may be exceptions to this, but if you think about the governments of this world, most of the time they're kind of focused in on just preventing crimes, right? In other words, you're probably not going to go to jail if you use just like filthy speech or crude language. Maybe you're not going to go to jail for maybe just wearing a certain type of clothing, or maybe if you're just not kind to somebody. Probably just going to get by just fine like that here in this world. But we know that these are all things that Jesus is concerned about. And so if we honor him as our king, that's going to make an impact to how we live our lives each day. Because we know we're going to be answering to him. And I do want to make it clear, obviously everybody's going to answer to Jesus one day. And that's why I said we honor a different king. We can either choose to honor him now or we're going to honor him at the end, but we're choosing now. Amen. So, again, that alone means that we're going to change our lives based on that principle. So now that we've established that, let's move to our second point. That is that we have a different speech. So again, going back to how I started out, if you notice somebody that's from another country, you could tell pretty quickly, if their accent is pretty heavy, and they're not, maybe they're speaking English, but it's just different, sounds different, or maybe they're speaking another language entirely. But either way, you realize probably not a native, right? They're probably not from around here. And so similarly, our speech should be different compared to people of the world. And again, clearly, this could be a lesson all its own, no doubt about it. Maybe some of the more obvious things we think about when it comes to this would be not telling lies or not using, crude or unwholesome language. We see things like that in passages like Ephesians 4:25 and also in verse 29. But instead of trying to cover everything there is to think about with speech, I want to focus in on one aspect that I think is pretty difficult to put into practice. I know it has been for me. And that is complaining. So let's look at Philippians chapter 2, starting in verse 14. We'll go ahead and read that. I know we're familiar with it, but it says, "Do all things without grumbling or disputing, so that you will prove yourselves to be blameless and innocent, children of God above reproach, in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you appear as lights in the world, holding fast the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I will have reason to glory, because I did not run in vain, nor toil in vain." So that little phrase at the beginning, all things without grumbling or disputing, that is challenging. I think we could all agree to that. So you mean we can't complain when we're standing in line at the grocery store, buying food that we didn't grow or prepare? When we're waiting in line, we can't complain about that? Or maybe we're stuck in traffic and our air-conditioned cars and comfortable seating. We can't complain about that? Okay, those are silly examples, but I think they are relevant. But what about those more serious situations that we have had to deal with? Maybe you or maybe a family member has had to deal with really poor health for a long period of time, and that's really been taking a toll on you and really wearing you down. Maybe your job situation has been creating a lot of stress and hardship on your family, maybe the lack of a job or just a difficult job. It could be a lot of different things, but serious things that aren't just simple situations. It's so easy to grumble or complain when things like that happen. Maybe ask, why is this happening? Why isn't this changing? And to be a little bit more negative about that. Now, I do think there's a difference, though, between talking about a difficult circumstance and outright complaining. And just to kind of to draw a funny illustration on that, let's say it's a hot day outside, and someone comes in and they say, "Boy, it sure is hot out there." Now, the other person comes in, same situation, they say, "Man, this heat is ridiculous. I'm sick and tired of it, and better temperatures and cooler temperatures, it better get here soon." Obviously, we can see a difference between those two responses. One is just acknowledging that, yeah, there's a difficult situation, not the most pleasant situation, and the other one is pretty upset about it. And so I think a lot of it comes down to our attitude, our willingness to bear up under those circumstances, and just that we're trusting in God through whatever that situation is. But again, it is a challenge. I understand that there are circumstances that are just hard when it comes to this. And we could ask the question, why is it that God is concerned about whether or not we complain? And I'm sure, again, there's many reasons, but he does explain some of it in this passage, actually. Let's read verse 15 again. It says, "So that you will prove yourselves to be blameless and innocent, children of God above reproach, in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you appear as lights in the world." So he says that by not grumbling, by not complaining, disputing, that type of idea, we demonstrate that we're blameless and innocent, and that we're children of God by that. And therefore, we create a distinction between the people in the world and ourselves. And furthermore, it says that, apparently by doing that, we become a light to the world, right? We're a light. So what's implied here is that the world is going to be full of complaining. That's just going to be something we can pretty much count on. But when we make a conscious effort to be different and to avoid that, we are going to naturally stand out. And it may be that our example gives us the opportunity to share the gospel with someone. Maybe they are curious about why we're more positive with our disposition. And maybe there's, why we're not always just talking about whatever's negative. Or maybe you're sharing in a negative situation with someone, but you're not complaining like they are, perhaps. And so that stands out. It creates a distinction. They wonder maybe why. And that could open an opportunity. But again, it's a challenge, and it's something that I need to work on. This is definitely not something I've perfected. But it's easy to ignore 1,000 blessings and focus on the one thing that seems to be going wrong in your life. Happens all the time. And I think at moments like that, we have to step back. We have to put things in perspective. We have to remember the blessings God has given us, how he has helped us through difficult situations in the past, and that whatever we're facing, it's most likely temporary, and God can bring us through it.
Amen.
So, if we're not supposed to complain, what should we be doing with our speech? Well, again, a lot we could say on that, all kinds of things, right? But let's just look at one thing here. In 1 Thessalonians 5, 16 through 18, it says, "Rejoice always, pray without ceasing, in everything give thanks, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus." So we're told to rejoice, we're told to pray, and we're told to give thanks in every situation. And isn't it amazing that we serve a God who wants us to be lifted up by focusing on the positive? I think that's amazing. What if the opposite was in this passage? All right? What if it said, always be sorrowful, don't bother talking to me, and find the negative in everything and make sure you complain about it? We would think, what a miserable religion. What are we doing, But too often we read these things and think, man, that's just too difficult to accomplish. I can't do this. And it's almost like we're saying, I'd rather be miserable. And again, I'm not saying this is easy, because there are hard circumstances, and I definitely have failed in this all the time. But I think it's wonderful that God does want us to be focused on this, and this is the ideal that he wants us to strive for.
Amen.
So there's much more to be said about speech. We don't have time for that all today, so we're going to move on to our next point. And that is that we have a different appearance. So again, you think about a stranger, maybe a foreigner, an exile, whatever word you want to use, someone that is not from this country, you may notice that in what they wear, right? They may have a different style, they may just have a totally different look, something from their culture that kind of shows up in their appearance. And so how does that apply to us as Christians? Well, so today I'm going to kind of focus in on this idea of what we usually refer to as modesty. So let's turn over to 1 Timothy chapter 2, 9 through 10, and I'll go ahead and read that. I know we're familiar with this, but it says, "Likewise, I want women to adorn themselves with proper clothing, modestly and discreetly, not with braided hair and gold, pearls, or costly garments, but rather by means of good works, as is proper for women making a claim to godliness." So it's true that Paul does single out women in this passage. Maybe because women usually are more interested in clothing than men. I don't know. But I don't think that obviously gives men just a pass and, okay, well, we can just wear whatever we want, right? If this principle applies to women, I think it's going to apply to men as well. But I do think it's interesting that Paul's main focus here, when he gives examples of what to avoid, it actually has more to do with not displaying your wealth than it does with kind of the traditional idea of what we think about as like tight and short, which is, I feel like that is interesting that that's the main thing he focused on. So it's something we need to consider, because we all live in a prosperous land, right? And some people might have that temptation to try to display their wealth through what they're wearing. But that being said, let's look at some definitions. So what do these things mean? Modesty, and discreetly. One definition of modesty, according to Oxford Languages, is behavior, manner, or appearance intended to avoid impropriety or indecency. And it also comes back to this idea of not wanting to show off. When you think about someone that's modest, they're not just, saying, oh, I did this and I did that, those type of things. And then according to the Cambridge Dictionary, discreetly means in a way that is careful, not to cause embarrassment or attract too much attention, especially by keeping something secret. So considering those definitions, I can certainly see why clothing that is too revealing, whether that be too tight, too short, would also not be appropriate based on this passage. I think it all kind of gets wrapped up in there. And I'm not here to define lines on that kind of thing, but I think we can all agree that there is a line somewhere. And it's something that we all, I think, should give a lot of conscious thought to. But this brings us back to the idea of being strangers and foreigners, right? If you dress modestly, you're certainly going to look a lot different than the people of this world, because they have left modesty behind a long time ago. But as strangers and foreigners, that's what we've been called to, right? To be different, to stand out from the world. And as for those, who are younger, maybe those who are still looking for spouses, I think this is an especially important issue. Because I know when I was looking for a spouse, modesty was something I paid a lot of attention to, actually. I essentially viewed clothing as somewhat of a window into the heart. It was a way to see, at least on some level, the measure of someone's maturity of faith. And I know that might be going a little strong with it. I know that's not accurate in all cases, and there are different ways that people interpret things. It's not the end-all, be-all measure. But I do think our clothing says something about what's on the inside, just like our actions and our speech do. But as far as looking for a spouse goes, I think it's good to consider that if you dress like the world, you're probably going to attract the world. And that's probably going to come with some trouble. But if we dress like foreigners, if you want to take that analogy, you may attract the attention of another foreigner. And I think that's ultimately going to lead to a much better outcome. So our last point for today, as far as this idea of being strangers, pilgrims, foreigners, is that we have a different mindset. So let's turn to Hebrews chapter 11, starting in verse 8. I'm going to read verses 8 through 10. It says, "By faith Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith he lived as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. For he was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God." So this passage describes about how Abraham was called to leave his home, to leave everything he knew, except when he brought his family, but to become a sojourner in a foreign land. And while he was there, he didn't have a permanent dwelling. He was in tents. He lived more of a nomadic lifestyle. And it says that while he was in that position, that he was looking for something. That he had his sights set on a city that wasn't built by man, but rather by God. So now let's skip down to verse 13, and we're going to read 13 through 16. It says, "All these died in faith, without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance, and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For those who say such things make it clear that they are seeking a country of their own. And indeed, if they had been thinking of that country from which they went out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them." So again, we see this idea that the patriarchs, they realized that they were strangers and exiles, and that they were away from their true home. And it says that they weren't just thinking about their original home, and Abram came from Ur of the Chaldeans, right? He said if he had that in mind, well, he could have gone back home. But rather, he was looking for something better, a better country, a heavenly one. And so as fellow strangers and exiles, we can ask ourselves, is that our mindset? Do we see ourselves as temporary residents here on earth? Do we remember that we are just trying to get back or get to our heavenly home? And I'll readily admit this is something that I struggle with. I get caught up in the here and now. I get caught up in the details of everyday living. And it's easy to sometimes forget about where we're actually heading. to let that big picture get a bit obscured. And it's something to be on guard against, and related to that is this idea of maybe trying to create a heaven on earth type situation. And to illustrate this point, I'm actually going to steal an analogy from my dad that I've heard him use. But let's say you're on a business trip, right? And you've got your hotel room booked, and you get there, you walk in, and you look around and you say, you know what, this will never do. And so you sit down and you just start making a list of all the things that you want to improve about this hotel room. And so you say, I'm going to switch out all the decor, I'm going to buy a new mattress because this mattress just isn't very comfortable, and maybe I'll just go ahead and install a jacuzzi tub while I'm at it in the bathroom. So obviously that would be ridiculous, right? You're only there a week. Why would you go to all that effort? It doesn't make any sense. So, and I'm not saying that it's wrong to enjoy the blessings that God has given us and the comforts God has given us in this life. But again, we want to make sure that we're not falling into this trap of this mindset that says, this life is my one shot at happiness, and I have got to do everything in my power to get that right. And that mindset can manifest in many different ways. Maybe you could spend all your time just trying to amass riches, right? So you're constantly working to try to make more money so that you'll just live a really nice, plush life. Or maybe your goal is to achieve perfect health so that you can live a long and full life. And so that's where you put all your focus. Maybe it's just on diet and exercise, and that's what everything is to you, is trying to be absolutely perfect healthy. Or maybe you believe heaven on earth can be achieved through politics. And so you think about, if I can just get my candidate in office, then everything is going to be just golden here. And so that's the cause that you invest yourself in. Or maybe it's just trying to maximize whatever is pleasurable in this life. It could just look like hedonism, basically, where whatever is fun, that's what I'm going to try to do. So there's a lot of different mindsets, and there's more of them out there. But those are the kind of things that you might fall into if you really did view this life and this earth as being your one home, and that this is it. After this, well, it's done. It's over. So you better just maximize it while we can, right? But a stranger and an exile realizes this earth is only a hotel room, that we're here just for a little while. And so we aim to be pleasing to God while we're here in the flesh, because we're seeking that eternal homeland with God and with all of the saints that we're sojourning here on earth with. So before we close, I do want to consider this idea of going home. Let's think about, maybe you've had a really busy day at work, and you're exhausted, you're so tired, and all you can think about is just, boy, I'm so looking forward to going home. Or maybe think back to when you were younger. Oh, let me back up. So going home. And you think about what's waiting for me there at home. You've got this comfortable place. It's familiar. You've got your family there that you can spend time with, that bring you so much joy. And so there's all of those positive things, and you just say, man, I'm just ready to go home. Or maybe you think back to when you were younger, maybe when you were in college, or maybe just you'd been away from home for a while, and think about how heartwarming it was to come back for a holiday, something like Thanksgiving or Christmas, and how nice it was just to come back, again, to a familiar place and to spend time with people you loved. It was amazing. Well, that's how we can think about going to heaven one day. We know that God our Father and Jesus our Savior are there, and we realize all the love that they've shown us in all this life. We think about the reunion with family members who have gone on before us, and also just our spiritual family who have helped so much to support us and encourage us throughout our lives. A place where there won't be any evil, there won't be any sin, any sorrow, any pain, all of the things that are so common to daily life on this earth. And so when you consider a place like that, it becomes a little easier to remember that we're only exiles, and we're just trying to get home, wanting to get back home. So that's the lesson for today. Just to review, as strangers and exiles, we honor a different king, we have a different speech, we have a different appearance, and we have a different mindset. So where are you this morning? It may be that you haven't started your journey yet. Maybe you're still at home here in this world, and that's where you're at. Well, you can change that today by turning away from the things of this earth and deciding to follow Jesus by being baptized and confessing him as your king. Or maybe you are a Christian, but maybe you've gotten so at home here that you've strayed from the path that goes back home. And maybe you just need some encouragement and strengthening from your brethren, some prayers. And we're happy to do that. Whatever your spiritual need is this morning, we'd encourage you to make it known by coming forward as we stand and sing.